Welcome to Electric Liberty Land, here on the Lions of Liberty podcast, your weekly shot of culture, comedy, and liberty with your host, Brian McWilliams.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Electric Liberty Land, episode number 269. As you can see, if you're watching the video, my goddamn camera still broke. Got a new webcam. Piece of shit. Didn't work well. Looked terrible. Couldn't zoom. Couldn't pan. Couldn't do anything. So I'm still using my crappy laptop one. Doesn't look terrible, but it's just annoying to me to deal with. And when things annoy me, I tell you people. That's the gift I give you. That's the love that I spread here at Electric Liberty Land. So, starting off the show, Ukraine, huh? Nailed it. Got that one exactly right. You know what? Shit happens, guys. What can I say? Sometimes you don't get things right. Your assessment is off. And I got to tell you, though, I'm going over in my head, right? And you say, Brian, how can you come to a conclusion that's so catastrophically wrong? You know, Putin marched in there. There's an honest-to-God invasion. He is attacking. There's bombs. There's troops on the ground from multiple fronts. I did not see this coming. I will admit when I am wrong, and I was wrong on this. A big swing and a miss. Got a little egg on my face to go along with all the rest stop donations from the men in the bushes. Yeah, you know, there's things dripping off the eyebrows here. But like I said, I do not, while my assessment was wrong, I don't understand what Putin is thinking. I think this has vastly more potential to blow up in his face than it does to have any sort of real strategic sense to it. Initially, right, and I tweeted this out, I was watching Fox News and Brett Baer's up there with his giant goofball fat head, and he had literally pointing to maps. And this is supposed to be reassuring how Russia had been contained, right? How Russia is surrounded by NATO and its allies and U.S. troops, right? And it's got the NATO flag and the U.S. flag in every country surrounding Russia. And I tweeted, I said, Brett Baer unintentionally highlighting exactly why Putin did what he did. But I didn't see this kind of invasion coming, right? I don't think it strategically makes sense. What made sense to me was Putin taking the Donbass region, right? Inglorious Donbastards, one of the greatest episode titles in the history of podcasts. What made sense was him taking that area since it was already removed from Ukraine. It was already existing as an autonomous state or multiple states with their own governments, with their own societies that were Russian ethnically, that believed in the Russian model, that didn't want to be part of the Ukraine, right? It made sense to me to say, okay, I'm going to take these on. My peacekeepers are there. But it made the statement that, look, I'm not going to go and sit idly by as you join NATO, as you accept armament to be positioned in the country on my borders. That's a no. Niet means niet, right? Now, having rolled in there, bombing runs in Kiev, the Holocaust Museum where, some 38,000 Jews were killed during the Nazi occupation. That just got blown up today. He is operating, my dog's sneezing behind me. That's nice. The way he's operating doesn't make any strategic sense to me because if anything, here's what's happened. Russia's army is not geared up necessarily for a full-scale, prolonged war, right? Russia is not the economic superpower it once was under the Soviet Union. They've got troops, sure, they've got weapons, sure, but they don't have them in mass amounts. They don't have the money to sustain a ongoing campaign. It's going to be $15 million or $1 billion a day it's costing Russia to have these troops there to fight them. Not only that, but Russia probably expected Ukraine to roll over and simply say, okay, we give up, we surrender. That has not happened. If anything, the Ukrainian people have solidified and have adopted a national identity of fuck Russia at this point. I was listening to, I think it was Natalia on Matt Kibbe's podcast, Kibbe on Liberty. And she was giving her insight into how this has galvanized Ukraine against Russia to unite as a people where they didn't really necessarily have this identity before. They didn't really necessarily have something to tie them all together. Now they do. Zelensky has been really impressive as a comedian turned now wartime leader of a nation that is being invaded. He has been impressive. He has refused to back down. They are providing arms and weapons to the civilian population, which we talk about libertarian inspiration here, guys. Look no further than, once again, a perfect example of a population, which, by the way, Ukraine does not have an armed population. They have some hunters, but not armed until the government armed them, right, with these automatic weapons to fight back. And the way in which the military is organized is kind of like each region has a force, a fighting force, but they don't have military might in regards to the way Russia does, the way the United States does, right? So the government has armed these people who have some military background or training, right? The civilian corps with armaments, with automatic weapons, with anti-tank weapons, and they are fighting back effectively to the point where now Russia's troops are being demoralized. They walked in, I'm sure they were told, much as Americans are told, you are going to be viewed as liberators. You're going to march into this country. They are going to accept you with open arms and say, oh my God, thank you for making us Russians again. Or in our way, thank you for making us democratic society. Thank you for liberating us from whoever we elected or whoever is the current dictator at the time, be they good or bad, from our perspective or from the perspective of the population. Always the pitch to the military is you will be liberators. That has not happened. The Russians have not been liberating anybody. They've been forcibly repulsed, told to go and fuck off. And now we see a demoralized Russian military. We see an overextended military that didn't expect this sort of prolonged campaign. You see now NATO, right, moving their troops in, helping to supply weapons. Now Russia's saying don't supply weapons. Hungary, like I was just talking to the CEO of Retalk, Pete Zaborsky, who was on the show. He's in Hungary. Hungary neighbors Ukraine. And I was talking to him. I said, I wish I had him on the show a week later instead of Mark Milke. No, Mark Milke's coming later in the show, by the way, guys. He's a very interesting interview about victim cult. So stay tuned for that. But I'm talking to Pete, who's in Hungary. And I'm like, what's your take, man, on the Second Amendment? Like, Hungary doesn't have a really dominant Second Amendment culture either. Again, it's kind of like hunting rifles. And he said, what's interesting is I'm looking at the Ukraine, right? As a Hungarian, we were a communist. We got taken over by the Russians. We fought the Russians and lost. Now, he's saying that he'd actually like to see more U.S. intervention because in Hungary's case, the Soviets were expanding. They thought they were going to get help from the West and they didn't, right? They got taken over. So he's saying, I'd actually like to see Ukraine get help from U.S. support or from NATO to reject these Russians. I still don't think that's necessary. I still don't think that I want us involved there. Actually, I know I don't. It's not our fight, and I don't believe in that. And I don't believe Americans should be going over and potentially dying or causing a possible nuclear holocaust, And it was kind of funny, and I tweeted out a pretty dark tweet, but there's an article circulating that the benefit of a nuclear war would be that it would cause a nuclear winter and solve climate change. And to which, of course, I replied, now that is a great reset. But literally, we're playing with nuclear brinksmanship here. Russia is nuclear armed. There's a reason why, look, at certain times you have to say, we don't approve what you're doing, right? Well, we're going to support Ukraine in their fight. Maybe you give them some arms here and there, but let me talk about the downside of that in a minute. But we're not going to get involved. We're not going to force us into a nuclear situation. There are times when a nuclear armed country might take something like this and you just have to go, yeah, okay. That's the way it's going to be. Because it's not worth it to everybody else in the world to have a nuclear holocaust because of it. And that's what we're winking at, right? That's what we're winking at across the bar. That's what we're giving a little lip tickle to across the bar as we get drunk on power and positioning and propaganda and think that we have to go out and save the world. Well, there's not going to be a world left to save, right? I don't want to fuck that chick across the bar that's eyeballing me with my nuclear dick, to put it eloquently. But we talk about arming Ukraine, and to get back to Pete Zaborsky here in Ukraine, Hungary denied weapons being supplied through Hungary to the Ukraine. And there's reasons for that. The Ukrainian prime minister basically said, look, I don't want Russia attacking my country because weapons are being transferred through it. I don't want Russian bombers killing civilians here, killing innocents in my country because weapons are being provided to the Ukraine. Now, in another standpoint, this is what Pete was saying over at the Retalk CEO. He was saying, my worry too is that just like with all of these other instances of the United States or of NATO or of anybody supplying arms to a rebel population, right? Well, what happens? One of two things. Now, with the Ukraine, I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are going to turn against the United States and use those weapons on us necessarily. But what if they don't win? What if we provide all of these weapons to the Ukraine, all of these potent, fresh, new arms, tanks, bombs, missiles, automatic rifles, whatever it might be. And then tomorrow, after we send these crates and crates and all these tactical arms, tomorrow Ukraine goes, you know what? We give up. Well, now we've just resupplied the Russian army. And again, to Pete's point, now what? Is Russia going to, are they going to stop there? Or are they going to look to expand? Are they going to look to go into Hungary? Are they going to look to go into any of the neighboring regions there now that they've been resupplied by us? And once again, we have an example of the United States and NATO, or whoever it might be, that's sending arms, the Germans, sending arms and helmets and whistles and guns and everything else. We have another example of those weapons being turned on us because we're supporting something that we are not specifically involved in, right? But let's go and cast our lot with these people and just see how it works out. Historically, it ain't worked out too well for us. So we shouldn't make that mistake again. Now, strategically, talking about Putin's decision, again, why I'm just still flabbergasted this is going on, that it's been how it's been, is that when you look at the way this has played out, right? You galvanize the Ukraine, which now even more, now the Ukraine wants even more to be in the EU. I should just call them Ukraine, not the Ukraine. If they were the Ukraine, they'd be part of Russia still, the Soviet Union. Ukraine has no appeal to be a part of the EU. The EU may hot ticket that thing right through there and get them approved. Even more so now, Ukraine would be willing to arm against Russia, to put weapons on the border. So this has backfired spectacularly in Putin's face. Unless he manages to take over Ukraine and win, and then everything else, it happens, which is possible. I don't think it's going to happen at this point. I think that he's going to pull out and have to turn tail. But I could be wrong. Obviously, I swung and missed on my assessment before of what was going to happen here. But now strategically, Putin has all of the other regions even more motivated to box him in because of this gambit. You have Ukraine galvanized against him, and should he be repulsed, even more incentivized to bring in all the missiles from NATO, to join the European Union, to make themselves a true opponent and a threat to Russia. And that's the ongoing danger of this, is Putin, to me, has lost his fucking mind to do this, where he could have easily taken the Donbass region, made his point, and then just said, we got a little more buffer zone here. I've expanded Russia's territory. These people that want to be part of it, great. This just doesn't make sense. That's what's scary to me. This doesn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense to this level, you have to wonder, what is the next step? I've already seen people talking about regime change in Russia. Good luck with that. Good fucking luck with that. But anyway, that's the Russian situation. Now, the interesting thing, too, about Russia and Ukraine is that we're seeing, to the highlight of libertarianism, right, and the concept of you don't need a standing military, you're seeing civilians arm themselves, right, and fight back. We are seeing yet another example, as America has learned so many times again, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in anywhere else we've gone after World War II, we're seeing the effectiveness of a motivated population protecting their home, where they know the land, they know the landscape, they have the opposition doesn't necessarily know who's fighting and who's not, but they are armed and they're motivated, effectively repulsing a much better armed, coordinated, and funded force. And Russia right now, even though you're reading the stories about them bombing these different regions, Russia is losing this war. As far as the goals, as far as the effectiveness of their attacks, they are losing this war. So that's interesting. Not only that, but also here's an example in free market economics insofar as warfare is concerned, guys. I mentioned Ukraine doesn't necessarily have the military, but they have security forces, right? And they have security forces right now offering bounties of $1,000 for any Ukrainian that blows up an enemy tank. Now, yes, this is risk that you take on as a citizen of that country, but $1,000, €1,000, wherever it might be, 1,000 Hungo bucks, or not Hungo bucks, Ukrainian rubles, whatever the fuck they're using there. That is a potent incentive, not only for you as a citizen, as a patriot of your nation, right, who you already motivated to want to get these Russians the hell out of your backyard, but now they're going to give you money for it. Here's the free market, guys. What's your risk level? What's your risk assessment? And it's $500 for like any other vehicle, Jeeps and whatnot to blow them up. There's Molotov cocktails they're stuck in. They're providing javelins to take out tanks. You are now using the marketplace to incentivize your own population to join the battle. You without conscription, right? You're not drafting people to go out and fight there. You're not forcing them like the Russians did back in the days, by marching behind them with Gatling guns. If they turn tail and try to run the other direction, you shoot them down. No, you're incentivizing them with money. Money talks. There's a reason mercenaries exist in the world. There's a reason that Blackwater is so successful. There's a reason that people will go out and risk their lives for something they don't necessarily believe in. But if you combine patriotism with that monetary incentive, especially when you're being invaded, well, looky here. Now you've got your own homegrown force motivated to go out there and fight against an invading army. Fascinating stuff. So anyway, guys, again, I own that I was completely wrong on this whole situation. I gave you my reasoning for it and my assessment as it stands now. So we'll see if that assessment holds up. Another topic I want to get to today before we talk to Mark. So a couple of things. Sean Penn, what a fucking asshole. I hate Sean Penn. I've always hated Sean Penn. I think he's a blowhard, and I can't stand his politics. I can't stand his face, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's funny that Sean is known for punching people, but yet has one of the most punchable faces I've ever seen. Not in a Sandman way, just in a general, good old-fashioned, God, that guy looks like a dick. And he is a dick. But Sean Penn, of course, that of preaching, that of bleeding heart causes, has now taken it upon himself to go over and document what's happening in the Ukraine. Now, this on its own is not a huge problem, right? You'd say, well, Sean, you're risking your own life. And that's what, for anybody that says America should go and join this, well, I've got good news for you. Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, or of Ukraine, just said he's removing all restrictions on foreigners coming and fighting for the Ukrainian cause. So good. All of you out there, all of you warmongering, rah, America needs to go out and fight this. Good news. America doesn't have to go and fight it. You can go and fight it. You can go put the money where your mouth is. Maybe you could go make yourself some 1,000 Ukrainian super bucks for blowing up a tank. But good news, you don't have to go and say on your soapbox on Facebook or on Twitter that we need to get involved in that. We need to send our troops over there because you can do it. Let's see how many of you do. It's open. The invite's there. Because I guarantee not one of you little keyboard cowboy pussies is going to get on there, take a plane over, and go fight for the Ukrainians. You're happy to send someone else to do it that signed up to protect the country and didn't know that they were going to be shipped off to the middle of nowhere with nothing to do with them to go and fight a war that they don't know anybody, they have no vested interest in whatsoever, and bleed out far from home. They don't need to do that. And you don't have a right to tell them to. Because you can go do it yourself. So put your money where your mouth is, get your ass to Ukraine, and if you don't, shut the fuck up. Get off Twitter, shut the fuck up, go lie in the bedroom, put on some emo music, because you're a fucking pussy, and you don't know anything you're talking about. You got no guts to follow through on it, so stay away from the rest of us. Now, let's get into, I want to talk about SNL. Saturday Night Live actually had one of the very few funny skits of the last 20 years. And as always, Saturday Night Live got into this way too late, right? They should have done this sketch a year ago. And I'm gonna save it because I'm going to talk about the SCOTUS selection first. And then we'll finish with Saturday Night Live before I talk to Mark Milke. But let's talk about the SCOTUS. Saturday Night Live, they did a sketch called Dinner Conversation. And it's about masking and COVID, right? But before we get to that, I want to talk about the SCOTUS pick. Now, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who I, of course, joked that Biden literally picked the blackest name he could, right? She's got fine qualifications, but I am 100% confident that Biden was given a list. And as I was joking with Rico and Howie and Odie on our, we have the Boring podcast, which is our comedy podcast. we're on a text chain, and I was like, what are the odds that Biden turned down 8 chicks named Susan or Kathy and went through the list and went, oh, Kelani Jackson-Brown, that sounds black. Hell, that's real black. You got to go with that girl. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. There's no fucking doubt in my mind that that's how he picked this person. But I was reading about her decisions, her background, and there is something to like here. Now, there's not a lot to like when it comes to labor law. She has a bad history of supporting unions, but granted, they're unions against the federal government, which I guess, 50-50, toss it up. But overall, the power of unions, I don't like her stances on that. But I'll tell you where she has some good potential. And that is that she has a background wherein her parents were directly impacted by the war on drugs. She has provided insight before into sentencing, giving judges more leeway instead of having mandatory sentencing, the 3-strike Clinton bill to get under you're going to jail for a minimum of 20 years because you possessed, crack cocaine or whatever it might be. She has fought back against that, which is great. She also could be a real ally in finally attacking the drug war tangibly. So I'm curious to see how this weighs in. If there is a challenge to the prohibition on a drug war, if there is a challenge to sentencing laws, how she can get her influence in there, where she's going to rule on it. And they're saying that as far as judges go, despite the fact that people are crying, the squads of the world are crying. The squad, by the way, which is doing a rebuttal. If you were a member of our Patreon, you could hear my Good Morning Fuckhead rant about this and how the Democrats are imbeciles. The squad is going to be doing a rebuttal to Joe Biden. Literally the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. It is undermining him and giving ammo to their opposition at all points. Like I just can't believe it's such a blunder. It blows my mind how stupid it is. But again, go to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty or lionsofliberty.locals, and you can join, get my morning rants, Good Morning Fuckhead, get the South Park recaps, which we're doing again now, me and Dan Smots, get the Conspiracy Corners, which we're recording, get all the good stuff. But as I said, the progressives really wanted somebody that was rabidly left. But meanwhile, this chick actually might be pretty, centrist Democrat when it comes down to it. I mean, you never know until they get in there. But she could be a lot better than we think. Definitely better than Sotomayor. She might not even be as left as Breyer. So we'll see. But I just want to share with that little bit of insight in there that we could, on one of the biggest issues, right? The war on drugs is still, we don't talk about it enough anymore because all this other shit with COVID's going on and foreign policy is going on and the Fed and inflation is going on. The drug war, guys, is still out there. It is still a prime driver of inequality. It is still a prime driver of sentencing, of people's lives being ruined for nonviolent measures. And as I'm going to talk to with Mark Milke coming up here, also a driver of, if there is a real thing called systematic injustice or systematic racism, it's the war on drugs. So let's not forget, that is out there. It is still one of the top 3, probably by far, maybe even the single most important issue for libertarians, in my opinion, still to this day because of the wide-ranging impact it has. But this chick might be good on it. Okay, let me get through to the Saturday Night Live sketch, and then I'll wrap that up and I'll bring in my interview with Mark. So what I'm going to do here, because I don't want to get pulled from YouTube, and they will either demonetize or force me to clip it out on YouTube. So what I'm going to do here is, if you watch the video, hopefully just playing the video isn't going to get pulled down. But if you're not watching on YouTube, go to join on Odyssey. Odyssey is not censoring us. We love that platform. We're on there. You can watch all of our videos on Odyssey, so go over there and find it. But I'm going to play the video in the background muted. That should stop me from getting, hopefully, auto-flagged by algorithms. But who knows? If it's just the video and they can pick that up, that might do it too. So I'm going to play the video behind me as I talk through this little segment and talk about this SNL skit, which, as I said, is about a year too late. Because what has happened here is that, hold on, let me pause this. So what has happened here is that SNL finally has come around to the realization that, yes, these fucking COVID protocols don't do anything, right? Now, this opens up, they're at a dinner party. You got John Mulaney in there, who is very leftist, but also so. Saturday Night Live, thank you for your service. Thank you for finally coming around to the reality that is all around us. But it would have been culturally appropriate to do it a year ago. However, the silver lining of this, of course, is that if Saturday Night Live, if ultra progressive, scared of its own shadow for offending anyone on the remote left, let alone, they're happy to offend the right side of the country because they know that the right side of the country hasn't watched that show in decades. I haven't watched that show in decades. If they are finally able to make fun of this and call the spade a spade, that shows you that the broader cultural context, the broader progressive base is thinking this. So there is your, as they used to say on The Daily Show, maybe they still do, there is your moment of Zen, guys. There is your white pill for the day. If Saturday Night Live is willing to do it, then we might just be coming out of this thing just in time for nuclear war. All right. Before further ado, I'm going to get into my interview with Mark Milke, the author of Victim Cult. So please enjoy. All right, so as promised, I am here with my guest today, a man who has written a book that is touching on one of the key topics that I'm interested in. I think we all are, because it's such an overreaching pain, a thorn in all of our sides, which is victim culture. It is Mark Milke, who is the author of The Victim Cult and also the head of a new think tank starting up in Canada. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
It is a pleasure, sir. And we were introduced actually by a mutual acquaintance, Fergus Hodgson, who I have nothing but respect for. Love that guy. So big shout out to Fergus. And tell me a little bit about, you're in Canada. Before we jump into the victim culture, how are things up north? How are things in Canada and everything you're dealing with right now?
That's a wide open question, of course. Well, we had the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, as you probably know. It's one of the few times that, Canada gets coverage around the world. Now, look, I don't agree with, truckers' demands that, prime ministers have to resign unless their agenda is met, any more than I think, people should be able to show up, and demand any elected government resign. There's a protest, all that. Nonetheless, it was a signal of great frustration up here. Unlike, say, the United States, we don't have a lot of what I'd call direct democratic, pushback mechanisms, right? We don't have recall in most of Canada. Referendums are very few. So you guys in woke San Franciscans get to recall 3 school board trustees who wanted to rename schools just because they're named after Abraham Lincoln. That's crazy. We don't really have those mechanisms for the most part up in Canada, and I wish we did. So that's something I want to work on at the new think tank. But we're like pretty suffused with victim culture up here. I mean, if you think the United States is bad for, people say, my status today is due to something you or your ancestors did 50 or 200 or 1,000 years ago, come to Canada, because it's even worse up here for that kind of thinking.
Yeah. I'm shocked to see how accelerated that process has been in Canada. I mean, I'm shaking my head. Obviously, Jordan Peterson and everything that's happened to him is one example, but just in general, I had made this observation a couple shows ago about how the United States in so many ways leads culture, right? And, as far as, I think, starting this woke nonsense movement and the victim culture movement, but yeah, to see Canada just run with it, to see the way the UK has run with it. And of course, there's a lot of shared overlap there. Obviously, a love of the monarchy still exists for some bizarre reason in Canada. But, why do you think that is, that Canada has just taken this and run with it so hard compared to the US?
Well, wow, that's a big question. I think a lot of reasons. I mean, why, some Canadians anyway are into victimology, if I can put it. I think part of it is an attack on Western civilization that happens in Canada, like the rest of, English-speaking countries, where there's this historic guilt now over, an imperfect past. Well, welcome to the world, right? As I write about in The Victim Cult, look, I mean, to look back in history and say, look, it wasn't perfect, and your ancestors picked on my ancestors, or the reverse, and then feel guilty over it and claim that, maybe you're a beneficiary of privilege. I mean, that's a common kind of refrain these days among some, not me. I don't suffer from liberal white guilt at all. But for those who do suffer from that, I mean, they're looking back and going, oh, isn't it awful that the world wasn't perfect? Yeah, it wasn't perfect. But the key is comparisons. I mean, for example, I came across some great stuff about the city of Victoria. This is, speaking of monarchs, the Queen.
Mhm.
The city of Victoria in British Columbia was named after Queen Victoria. Well, in 1862, they're welcoming Black Californians because we're a more tolerant country up here, and of course, slavery hasn't ended yet in the United States. Even, and free Californians,
Mhm.
Black Californians, though, are suffering from terrible prejudice in that state, even though it's not a slave state. So, I mean, Canada was Canada perfect in 1862? No. Was the United States perfect in 1776? No. But I think both countries had the right ideals, which is the individual matters. And, over time, of course, what has happened in both countries is, the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. has been actualized. Let's look at character. Let's look at, your merit. Let's look at other stuff other than your skin color. And we finally got to a place where that was starting to happen. And then, whoa, all of a sudden, everybody looks back and says, history wasn't perfect. And I think my status today is a result of something your ancestors did to my ancestors. Wow, really? That's a stretch. Long answer, short question. I just think Canadians actually have a little more left wing, and I think that's the influence of Quebec, which is about 25% of the
Mhm.
population. I mean, imagine if France was stuck in the middle of the United States, and
Yeah.
was 25, 30% of the population. It would pull your politics left and collectivist, and I think that explains a good chunk of what's happening in Canada. In addition to, if the American, if you in the United States have a conservative president, for example, the left in Canada reacts to that.
Yeah.
And then the anti-Americanism comes out. So, like a 15-year-old, the left in Canada will do something opposite of what's happening in the United States. Although it doesn't seem to work in reverse. When Democrats are down there, like Osama bin Laden,
Just
right,
no.
that really was unintentional, like Barack Obama. It just, you don't have the same effect. I mean, all of a sudden, the Canadian left worships an American president in that case. So we've got a weird, insecurity up here vis-a-vis the United States, and have probably had it since you kicked out United Empire loyalists in 1776.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You bring up the topic of history, and that's something that has also rubbed me the wrong way, insofar as you said, this guilt that people feel, or saying that, oh, well, my ancestors were wronged, and you ran roughshod over them. Number one, I always think back and say, okay, it was a much more difficult time, right? People seem to project backwards into history the comforts we have today, the communications, the trade, all these things were evolving, right? So there was no simple time, and it was, for decades upon decades, millennia, a culture of conquering. It was a true battle for life and death over
Well, it
resources,
still
and
is,
people
isn't it? I
forget
mean,
that.
look at
Well, yeah.
Ukraine, it still is. That's
True.
unfortunately the history of the world. But
Yep.
look, you're onto something. I think the mistake, and I write about this in the victim cult. I mean, think about the last century. I mean, at least communists looked to the future and envisioned a utopia. They were dead wrong.
Hmm.
I'm a free marketer. I'm a free enterpriser. I think they were dead wrong, obviously, about the economic system and how to get to prosperity. Nonetheless, I mean, the least, one thing you can say for them is they weren't trying to recreate, a utopia in the past. You've got people today who look back and weirdly get disappointed because the past wasn't perfect. I think the way to kind of correct that is what Thomas Sowell talked about, these cosmic utopians, basically, or cosmic justice, rather. Well, you can't correct the past, and all you end up doing is creating new victims in the present. So if you're going to say, well, your group picked on my group, and now my group gets to pick on your group, guess who that hurts? Individuals on the ground. I mean, a great concrete example is affirmative action, racial and gender quotas. I mean, if you're going to make up for what you think is the effect of past, discrimination upon employment and incomes today, you're going to have to find somebody to make a victim today, and make them victim of a quota system. So, and they make the same mistake over again, which is you're not paying attention to the individual. I mean, that's always been the mistake in history, and it's the mistake now. You have to look at the individual and treat the individual as equal in law and policy. And because our forefathers didn't do that at some point in the distant past, doesn't give people a right to do that again today, based on comparing collectives and U.S. Census data. So I think that's part of the problem, Brian, is that people just don't get that they're making the same mistake under new justifications, which is not treating the individual as an individual.
Right. Well, you talk about in the book the fake victim, as you call it, the fake victimhood of 20-something totalitarians. And it is definitely interesting. I mean, not only with what's happening with COVID and totalitarianism expanding, but even prior to that, the censorship environments, the ways in which the millennial generation wants to force something through, or not even, I guess, pre-millennials now, the 20-somethings, want to force people to think, to act, to stay in lockstep with this ideology. I mean, why do you think it is this generation specifically that has kicked this into high gear?
Good question. Maybe 35 years away from the fall of the Berlin Wall, or almost 35 years. They can't compare East Berlin to West Berlin, for example. It's not top of mind. And maybe just the normal self-righteousness of youth, right? I mean, most of us when we're 16 or 20, we think we know it all, right? And then, we grow up and we find our parents have learned so much, right?
Right.
I think that's part of it, right? There's a self-righteousness that comes with youth. There's a natural desire to want to change the world for the better. So that's not a bad impulse, but it combines with this unrealistic notion that, words can change everything. Or that, there's one cause, right? And that's the great myth today. And it's what I write about in the chapter on Black Lives Matter and the victim cult. The notion that racism is responsible for all differences in outcomes between groups when you compare them, like in the census data, for example. I mean, this is Ibrahim Kendi, right? I mean, everything is due to racism. No, family breakdown matters. Educational levels matter. Yeah. Culture matters. If you live in the American South, in the South, we know that on average, incomes are lower in the South. So if you have a greater proportion of Black Americans in the South, which is the case, then Black Americans on average are going to have lower incomes as a result of that factor alone. So there's all these other factors. But it's much easier when you're 20, perhaps, to latch onto a simple theory like, oh, racism explains all. And I guess the other problem is you haven't lived long enough at 20, with respect, unless you read a lot of history by the time you're 20. You haven't lived long enough to understand history and actually how good we have it today. And that a systemically racist society is one where you can't go into a cafe because you're Black, or you can't live in certain neighborhoods because you're Chinese. That doesn't exist in the United States today. It hasn't since at least the 1960s in the case of Black Americans. So I think it's a lack of historical perspective as well on the part of some, not all, some millennials.
Well, you mentioned, of course, Thomas Sowell, who, I think is an absolutely brilliant person. May he never die. But, he had talked about in several of his different books that I was reading, just what you're keying on there, and specifically in regards to Black America and talking about culture, talking about opportunity, talking about the culture of, and I think a lot of this is also due to, a lot of the drug war and instances where when people talk about an unjust society, when we talk about systematic racism, right? There's instances where I can point and say, you've got it right in this regard. Exactly. The drug war would be an example of that for me, wherein a systematic application of a goal to eradicate drugs has disproportionately targeted a certain portion of the population, predominantly Black America. But it is not the end all be all. As you said, one of the biggest indicators of social mobility, of economic mobility, is an intact family unit. So that comes back to culture in addition to the drug war, to your point. And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And a lot of these generation of millennials just don't see that, or they've imbibed a portrait of reality in mainstream media and leftist culture. And maybe let's talk a little bit about that too. Do you think the predominant culture of entertainment is also playing in perfectly to this ideology and to this victim cult?
Well, probably, because again, Hollywood's a cliche, mainstream media is a cliche, but let's go with it for a moment. There is some diversity, not as much as you'd want in traditional media and in Hollywood, maybe even less so in Hollywood. But there's something to that. But think about the mindset of actors or script writers or, films in general. They're stories and they're artists. And in essence, they have a blank canvas upon which they can paint whatever they want. So you can create a romantic vision of the world in 2 hours and solve everyone's problems. You can also be self-righteous because, you're not doing the hard work of, Thomas Sowell we've just talked about, of empirical data dives, right? Most people don't do that, and especially Hollywood actors and screenwriters and script writers. So you can create this wonderful story. A good example of this was, what's the movie that came out a couple of years ago? Crazy Rich Asians or something? Like, what was
Crazy Rich Asians, right?
I thought it was a great movie, except for the beginning where they show like this massive amount of racism in some London hotel in 1995. London, England, this was the most cosmopolitan city a century ago, where Mahatma Gandhi and his colleagues praised London as, tolerant of them in like 1905 or whatever it was. So, I think Hollywood simplifies things. And again, if you don't do your deep reading of history and have a better understanding of flows in history and the realities of history, you can swallow this stuff and go, yeah, London must have been really racist in 1995 because you were 1 year old and you don't know any better. Really? So I think Hollywood, the entertainment sector in particular, obviously doesn't help this. And it's all, if it leads, it bleeds. That's an old, saying in the media. It's true of Hollywood as well. And so again, I think people make the wrong cause and effect links. It's really difficult to think about culture, family breakdown, educational levels, geography as possible causes for differences in outcomes between different cohorts. But I mean, one clear example, which I think, defeats the notion where you live in some systemically racist society in the United States, is East Indian American incomes. They're at the top of the scale. Same with Taiwanese or, Chinese American incomes if they come from Taiwan or Hong Kong.
Or even Somalian Americans in the United States. Their income levels are absolutely astronomical compared to many groups. Yeah.
But it also happens to be the fact they're the most educated among the population. They've got the most, the greatest proportion of degrees, Taiwanese Americans, East Indian Americans. So, hyphenations aside, that's just the reality. And so I don't know that much of this seems to sink through at the university level these days. And maybe it's, it's the modern version of a passionate belief. It's replaced the rule of religion. And so it feels much better to whip yourself and pretend that your privilege has led you to Yale. And so, you've got to make up for that somehow, wearing hair shirts and the rest of it. So, but I do think it's a problem because in the victim cult, I describe mild, moderate, and murderous victim cults. I mean, Yale is on the mild side, nobody's getting killed. Culture revolution, though it may be at Yale and other universities these days, no one's quite doing a Mao style culture revolution or Khmer Rouge, but it is on the mild side for sure. But it is a victim cult narrative and mentality, and it's not helpful. Because actually you don't address real problems in real people's lives then.
Yeah. Well, we talk about history, and I want to touch on something before we move on to another topic. And, we talk about the totalitarianism, right, of these younger people, how they don't understand history, but also how they, you're saying they're self-flagellating. They want to pretend they're victim, but also they want to punish people who don't agree with them while viewing themselves as victims, punishing those who disagree with the victim ideology. So something I thought was interesting in the book is that Hitler, of course, everybody wants to call everybody else Hitler. It is the go-to comment of the day. It seems that you can't read a news article without Hitler being shoved in there or whoever, whatever the Hitler du jour is. But Hitler himself was essentially the head of a victim cult. And I think that's a fascinating juxtaposition to make today as these people call everybody Hitler and go into the victim ideology. So tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, and of course, if everyone is Adolf Hitler, then no one is, right? And that actually is very dangerous because you're not taking seriously what happened in Nazi Germany and what led to it. Well, what led to it? Most people probably have a sense that Germans after the Versailles Treaty felt victimized. In the victim cult, I actually take apart the Versailles Treaty. Germans were not victimized in the way that people think they were with the Versailles Treaty. It was actually more generous than people give it credit for. And in fact, Germans victimized themselves by running up inflation so they could pay off their war debts and worthless German marks. So, I dispute that in the victim cult. But going back further, and Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, long before they came along, Germans thought of themselves as victims. And there's a very good reason for this, because they were. At the end of the 18th century, they were occupied by France. Early 19th century, the Germans kicked them out of the territories they're in, the German territories they were in. And Germans begin to try and search for identity, a renewed identity. What does it mean to be German, right? And it's almost a psychological response. You get beat up and you think, what did I do wrong? Or how can I protect myself the next time? Well, we need to be stronger. And so you kind of search for this identity as an individual, and in this case, as a nation. What they did, though, is they lapsed back to romanticism about German history. They go back like 600 years to Frederick the Great when he was busy conquering Europe, like German leaders seem to do every couple of centuries. And, they begin to romanticize this. And what's a pure German? Well, a pure German isn't Jewish. A pure German isn't English. They didn't like free markets. They were collectivists. And so they came up with this cultural notion of what it meant to be German. Now, they worship pure culture. We're back into that today. All sorts of movements think the solution to say, a stronger Black America is to be culturally Black, or in indigenous matters, to be culturally indigenous. You see this all over the place. It's actually very dangerous. In Germany's case, they began to be in this victim narrative. We're victims of everyone, of the English, of the Jews, of people not like us. And this was around for a long time before Adolf Hitler came along. And later in the 19th century, this notion of cultural purity combines with the notion of race purity. And then later on, this is glommed onto by the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. Oddly enough, Adolf Hitler even thought of himself as a victim. In the victim cult, I write about how, like in 1910, he's in Vienna. He buys a lottery ticket. He doesn't win. And he complains to whoever is listening at this point, his friend or someone who writes this down, that he's a victim of the universe, basically, which didn't allow him to win a lottery. Like, think about the craziness of this. And in his final days in World War II, Adolf Hitler blames Winston Churchill. He blames Franklin Roosevelt. He blames the Jews, of course. He blames everyone else for starting the war that he started. But he's a victim. And he's a victim even of his own people. So, I mean, think about the craziness of this. The subtitle to the victim cult is how the grievance culture hurts everyone and wrecks civilizations. And what I meant by that last bit was Hitler and the Nazis not only destroyed the land of Bach and Beethoven, a pleasant pastoral, place that, has lots of fatty food and nice flowers and nice music, and turned it into the land known for Dachau. Not only do they destroy their own civilization, they almost destroy ours in the English world, right? And on the cover of the victim cult, I have a picture of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is, and just after the Blitz, where you see smoke rising from around St. Paul's Cathedral. The Germans, the Nazis, almost destroyed our civilization. So these victim cults, they can be mild, like at Yale, where woe is me, I'm victim of a microaggression. But they can be murderous in some extreme cases, like the case of Nazi Germany. They thought of themselves as victims. They weren't, but they created a lot of new real victims in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed also that, you talk in the book as well about, how we have to stand up against or stand for, I guess, an opposition of the victimization of history, but also how, and we talked about this at the beginning of the interview, Western civilization, and I mentioned how people become too confident, too complacent, and then look to tear down from the inside, and that's what I feel victim culture is now, is they're looking to sacrifice. It's almost like, don't sacrifice the good for the great, or I'm thinking of the exact phrase, don't let the enemy of the good be the perfect. Something
don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yeah.
Thank you. There we go. I reversed. Yeah. I verbally dyslexized that. Yeah, So, it seems that is what is happening. These people are willing to throw away everything that we've achieved, everything. I mean, me growing up, and I'm 42, right? When I was growing up, it was be colorblind. Everybody's the same. Very Martin Luther King. Your character is defined by who you are, not the color of your skin. And that was really what it felt like we were working towards. And now that has been flipped on its head, torn asunder. You have people at Harvard telling you, like a prominent professor at Harvard said, you can only judge people by the color of your skin. And if you don't, you're a racist. I mean, they are looking to tear down all of the benefits, all of the advancements of Western civilization in this effort to chase the perfect and seemingly have no cognition or no recognition of the damage they're doing. How do we fight this?
Yeah. Well, we fight it perhaps by identifying it. We fight it perhaps. It's a bit like, and this is one of the reasons I wrote The Victim Cult. I think, people will get tired of this monocausal explanation if they're the least bit curious. And it's a bit like, when you walk by a restaurant and you're not hungry yet, you don't even think you're hungry. Maybe it's 4 p.m. You're on vacation, you're not hungry yet. And then you walk by a restaurant and you smell some wonderful food. Maybe you smell a steak, or I don't know, maybe you smell some dish that wafts into your nostrils and you're like, I think I'm going to have that for dinner. All of a sudden you recognize you're hungry. I think it's a bit like that intellectually as well, where if you're given simplistic explanations for too long and you're the least bit curious, or they don't seem to, work really as a solution to whatever the problem that's being identified is, then eventually you start to become hungry for a better explanation, better food, or in this case, a better explanation. And I think that's a little bit of what's happening now. But I think you're onto something. I think part of it is as well, it's much tougher to do the hard work of change, right? And it's much harder to be honest about maybe your own community. I mean, I'm not a collectivist, so I don't take responsibility for everybody else that has my skin color or whatever. I mean, so I don't care about that stuff. But for those who think this is a priority, it's more difficult to be perhaps self-critical. In The Victim Cult, I started out by writing about the narrative of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Well, for those who don't know their Sunday school lessons, Cain and Abel are,
sadly, I do.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's okay. I mean, they are the characters, and, the sons of Adam and Eve. And the story is that they both offer a sacrifice to God. All of a sudden, it turns out, God's not a vegetarian. He likes meat, and he rejects Cain's, offering of vegetables. Cain's mad. And the traditional Sunday school lesson is, don't get mad. Don't be bitter. Just do the right thing, and your sacrifice will be accepted. Bring me the right sacrifice. Now, there's ways to interpret this. I have a little bit of, clever fun with it this way. I think, well, maybe we should sympathize with Cain. Maybe, how's he supposed to know, that God's not, favor of vegetables today, that he only wants meat as a sacrifice. Maybe Cain has a right to be angry. But instead of actually confronting the source of his woe, God, like some other Old Testament characters do, Cain does what we often do. We get lazy. We look around for someone to blame. He blames his own brother. And then he murders his own brother. And when God confronts him on this, he evades responsibility again, which is typical of a victim, right? They won't look at themselves, their role in creating the situation they're in, even if we should sympathize with them initially. They go too far. They create a new victim, as Cain does. And even when God confronts him, he doesn't take responsibility and says, am I my brother's keeper? And you can almost see the sneer on his face. And he thinks of himself as a victim. And isn't this just like, the fake victims anyway that we know? I don't mean real victims. We should have compassion for those. But I mean the fake victims that we know, it's never their fault. It's always someone else's fault. They won't look, or, in terms of societal discussions, well, it's never about education. It's never about culture. It's never about family breakdown. It's never about anything else. It's just about racism. Really? Okay. That's a monocausal explanation. So I think this is part of human nature. I think it's just easier to go there. It's much tougher to do the hard work of reforming ourselves.
Yeah, without a doubt. I never really thought about that, the Cain and Abel story that way, but that's really appropriate, and I think spot on. Now, with the last few minutes we have left together here, I wanted to talk about, you have a personal story at the end of the book, which I thought was pretty interesting, because you talk about your grandparents, you talk about, of course, your family was from Poland and was booted out, basically, during the communist revolution there and takeover. So tell me a little bit about that, because I liked the moral of the way in which your grandparents lived and carried themselves versus what we look around with today. So tell us a little bit about that.
Ukraine and Poland, actually, Germans in Ukraine and Poland. And this chapter at the end of the victim cult, you're right, it comes in because I'm trying to say, listen, be careful how much you blame on the distant past. You can compensate people for something you did yesterday. So in the late 1700s, the Quakers compensate the slaves they freed. They understood they'd done a terrible evil against Black Americans. They compensated them. But these days, when you look back to reparation arguments, for example, you look back 150, 200 years, and people saying, well, we should compensate. My point in this last chapter in the book is actually our own choices often explain much more. The further you go back, I think the weaker other people's choices have an effect on you. My parents, my grandparents. So I bring in my grandparents to say, look, my grandmother, 3 years old, they leave Ukraine as Germans in 1914, end up in Latvia. They're trying to cross the sea to Canada. World War I starts. They don't go anywhere. And they basically circle around Europe for about 13 years. They go back to Ukraine. They end up in Siberia. The Marxists show up. They get booted out of there. They finally come to Canada in the late 1920s. On my grandfather from Poland, a German living there, leaves also late 1920s. They suffer through the Great Depression. My grandmother lost two of her sisters when she was wandering around Ukraine, Siberia, Central Europe in the 1920s. Now, they come to Canada eventually. They suffer through the Great Depression, though. Now, the thing is, they made the most of what they found in Canada. And I remember growing up where I'd see the red roses out in the front garden and the fruits and vegetables in the back garden. And I think those were reminders, my grandma's case anyway, of, perhaps the fruits and vegetables she saw as a kid growing up in Ukraine and Central Europe. I'm almost positive it was. But I never heard them complain. And they were just grateful for the Canada they came to, full of peace and prosperity. And to me, this says something, because my grandmother was a victim. In her case, not only did she lose two sisters, one time I saw her sign a document with an X, and I asked my dad, I said, why didn't grandma sign her name? And he said, well, she never learned how to read or write, right? She was a child, basically a child refugee for, 13, 14 years, worked on a farm and never learned how to read or write, never went to school. And yet I never heard my grandmother complain. She kind of brought the best of the past, right? The fruits and vegetables, the red roses, very German of her, perfect garden. And from the past into her present, where I grew up in a very pleasant town in southern British Columbia, a bit like the Napa Valley. And so that was my grandmother, and my grandfather was the same. And so I think that speaks to something, because, I could try and blame my past now on what happened in the 1920s. Well, if only my grandparents had done X, Y, or Z, I'd be better off today. Well, you can kind of make that argument to a little bit, but listen, the further you go back, really your own choices are more definitive. And, I don't think we can really go back more than a generation or two, even though it's tempting to do so. I think instead, your own choices are much more definitive. Not completely, but there's so many things. I mean, think about the tide of history, of immigration, of events, our own choices, who we marry, who we don't marry, where we choose to live, the education we get or we don't, our own attitudes. All of that matters much more, at least in a liberal democracy. Listen, if you're in Adolf Hitler's Germany or Joseph Stalin's Russia, yeah, of course your choices are much more limited. If you're a slave in 1850, of course your choices are much more limited. But when you're talking about a liberal democracy in 2022, to really blame something on 50 years ago or 150 years ago, or Bill Clinton blaming the Crusades partly for 9/11 1,000 years ago, that's a stretch, a real stretch. So the story of my grandparents is basically to say, listen, there are ways to look at life that I think are more helpful as an individual and as a society.
Yeah, I'm without a doubt, and it's kind of interesting too that you talk about people coming over from these places in which they were real victims, and so many people today. I mean, obviously, Black Americans, yes, they were victims so many generations ago, but people now, they are removed, as they talk about. The fall of the Berlin Wall is recent, but we were removed from that. The people now are so insulated in America, in Canada, in many of these, in the UK. They're not being invaded. They're not under the boot of authoritarianism, and yet they want to usher it back in because they seem to have lost any sense of comparison or any direct reference of history or even the dangers that are ever present that we've fought to maintain. And I think that's a lot of why they're kind of content to let it flit away.
Well, and they're just again, I think they don't realize how much you have to work to get away from collectivism and tribalism. And, and again, and I don't know why people expect perfect outcomes. Thomas Sowell summarizes this perfectly, and I quote him in The Victim Cult on this. I mean, Italians dominated the fishing industry around the world for centuries, unlike the Swiss. Obvious reason. The Italians have a lot of coastline, and when they immigrated, they already had the fishing gene, so to speak, in them, right? That's what they did. You wouldn't expect the Swiss to have, to fish in equal proportion as a percentage of their population to the Italians in comparison to the Italians. So there's all sorts of reasons why different cohorts differ, and you see that in the statistics. But people don't want to do that hard work. It's easier to latch on a simple explanation. And then when they get frustrated, they revert to, I think, pride. And, if you're not attached to, say, a grand narrative like life, liberty, and the pursuit of, happiness, the American narrative, or the French narrative of liberty, whatever it is, if you're, or even a religious identity, which can be racial, in Christianity or Judaism or even Islam, or other faiths or beliefs. If you're not attached to a bigger narrative, is the best way to put it, in a more positive narrative, then you get stuck reverting to thinking about this, like the skin color, instead of what's in your heart and what's in your head. It's just easier to revert there. But that becomes really dangerous because, of course, none of us can change our skin color or ethnicity, where we were born. And so I think that's the danger of identity politics today, and why so many people are entranced by a victim cult. It does give them an identity, right? And they can fasten onto it and say, and they can point to examples in history that seem to have occurred yesterday because of social media. You can pick up a video from 50 years ago and say, your ancestors did this to my ancestors. Yeah. Therefore, it explains me today. No, it doesn't. And it's actually really dangerous to think that. And it's dangerous to think in that collectivist mindset. That's what Germans did. That's what Rwandans did. I write about that in The Victim Cult. And it's, by the way, I don't think it's very American. As an observer, I just don't think that's your narrative. Your narrative is the buck stops here. Harry Truman, I'm taking responsibility. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I mean, you wanted to get away from the European cauldron of identity politics and found a nation on the individual. Were Americans perfect? Were Canadians perfect? Were the Brits perfect? Were imperialists and colonialists around the world perfect? In the English-speaking world? No. But that's not the point. The point is attention to the individual and her rights and the responsibilities as an individual in law and policy. That's the great success of English civilization, more than even Western civilization writ large. So that's what we should pay attention to and renew. And in the case of the United States, I think it's terrible that people are ripping themselves apart, a la Europe, a century ago or now.
Yeah, I believe you are exactly correct. Mark Milke, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you, the book? If you are willing to talk about the new think tank, I'm not sure how far along it is yet if you want to promote that, but please tell people where they can find you. Sure. and get the book.
So The Victim Cult is available at thevictimcult.com. From there, you can probably link to my website, markmilke.com, but victimcult.com. The new The new think tank is going to be called the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, and we're going to look into some of these issues of race and identity and history and the rest of it. But if you go to victimcult.com, that's a good starting place. And there it has links to Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, and the rest. But you can find the book across the United States and in your local bookstore.
Beautiful. And I will, of course, link to that in the show notes for this very podcast. So again, Mark, thank you so much for coming on and joining me on Electric Liberty Land. Best of luck with the book. I hope it is read far and wide and makes, even if it's a small dent in what is happening, it will be a great service to us all.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up, guys, from me, Brian McWilliams, and Electric Liberty Land. But at the end of the show, I want to remind you, check out #FreeRoss, the fantastic song from Tyler Colford, a.k.a. Crypto Man, benefiting, of course, Ross Ulbricht. Also, check out Burnin', the apostrophe N, Daylight, our buddy Matt McKinley's awesome podcast, libertarianism, horse wrangling, and all that good stuff. And, of course, guys, check out our other podcasts here. The Lions of Liberty, we have other podcasts as well. The Boring Podcast. Me, Rico, Howie, Odie, hilarious, pure comedy. Well, not pure comedy. We do get into politics actually quite a bit more now than we used to. But it is one of the funniest shows you're ever going to hear. It is our Legion of Skanks where nothing is off limits, including making, well, references to the R word. I'll let your imaginations run wild with that. But check that out anywhere you want to listen to the podcast, The Boring Podcast. And, of course, Second Print Comics. Mark and Remza Martinez, they do breakdowns of different comic books, different TV shows for all you nerdlingers out there. So go check that out as well. Support us doing other things, please, guys, as well as sharing this show. I want you to share these other shows, to give them a listen, to give them a review, because we're trying to impact the culture here at Lions of Liberty. And just yelling and preaching to the choir is nice, but reaching other people is even nicer. So please support that. Also, guys, Electric Liberty Land, the solo feed. Go subscribe to that. I'm going to be doing a bonus show this weekend just for that feed. So make sure you check that out. Of course, the bonus show will also be for our Patreon crew, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty and lionsofliberty.locals before anybody else gets it on the weekend. So check that out. Thank you for your support. Share the show. Follow us on social media. And I don't know, go kiss your mother on the lips. That's it. From me, Brian McWilliams, from Electric Liberty Land, and from the Lions of Liberty. Always stay plugged in to Liberty. Now I have to get my things. I forgot to cue it up in time. All right, goodbye.